Hello and welcome to another episode of Principles of Editing. We're going to continue with the subject that we were dealing with in the last few episodes, and that is the creative role of the editor. But before proceeding any further, I'd like to ask you whether you have any questions to ask regarding any of the subjects covered in the previous 6 episodes.
Sir, I have a question. How important is the role of the director who is entrusted with the taking of the shots when the final editing of the product is done?
That's very important. If your material is insufficient, if there are lacunae in the material itself, how far can the editor salvage it is the question. Taking plays a very important role because I think when you are the director of a film, you have to have the editing scheme in mind. Not only within the scene. The shot breakdown will, in a sense, indicate to you the way the film is going to be edited, or the way the scene is going to be edited, the nature of the long shot, or the track shot, or maybe the crane shot, the close-ups, the over-the-shoulder shots, the subjective shots, and so on. Not only within the scene, but also from one scene to the next, you must know the magnification of the shot with which your scene is ending, and the immediate scene which follows is beginning. What is the magnification of that shot? The angle of that shot. There must be a relation so that the scenes flow. I think, therefore, taking has a very important role to play in the final product.
What is the relationship between the original screenplay and the final edited film?
Yes, again, this is related to the question which I was just answering. The original screenplay does not have a shot breakdown. It's the shooting script which has the shot breakdown. But through the original screenplay, you can have an idea about what the shots are going to be like. All great screenplay writers indicate in very subtle manners, that is, not by mentioning long shots, close shots, and trolley shots, but very subtly they indicate that you need to take a close shot or a long shot. Examples would be Bergman's screenplays. If you read his screenplays of Scenes from a Marriage, or Cries and Whispers, or Autumn Sonata, or Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible Part 1, Ivan the Terrible Part 2, you will find that these screenplays are indicative of the shooting script. Now, your question was, what about the final film? What is the relationship? Well, obviously, once a film is shot, it deviates a little from the screenplay. When it's being edited, based on this deviation, and based on what the director and the editor are thinking at a particular point of time, there would be certain changes. So there might be a shift from the way the original screenplay is constructed and the way the final product comes in front of the viewer, purely because the editor and the director believe that a shot placed here or a sequence shifted will do good to the film in terms of its communication. Any other question?
Yes, sir. Is there any relationship between editing and an assessment of the psychology of an audience?
Assessment of the psychology of the audience. That's a very significant question. But before I answer it, I want to ask you, anyone, what do you understand by this assessment of the psychology of the audience? Can you explain this? Can you say something?
Probably the editor might suggest that some particular scene or shots arrangement can differ. According to the editor's discretion, he might think that if the shots are arranged in the other way as the director had already thought of them, it might bring a better impact, or it might have a better impact. I also have a related question regarding this, that in case of excessive violent shot takings, probably when the shots were taken, it could have been that excessive shots have been taken of that incident. So does the editor have this discretion that he can suggest the director that some portions can be omitted for the sake of the audience psyche? I mean, it will create a deep impact on the audience psyche on something in this ground. Can editor give this suggestion to the director?
I'm sure the editor can always suggest, and he can suggest with regard to, well, excessive violence or with regard to aesthetics. But coming back to the first part of the question which she asked, that is the assessment of the psychology of the audience. What she's trying to say is that does the editor need to study the audience tastes? What will the audience like? For example, sometimes the pace of a film is dictated by what the editor thinks will be the reaction of the audience. If a shot is allowed to persist for a very long time, beyond its usefulness, perhaps the audience might be put off. Or, by studying the psychology of the audience, the editor might conclude that this rapid fire cutting, that is, shots lasting for very short duration on the screen, could lead to lack of comprehension on the part of the audience. The audience is not comprehending because the shots are moving so fast. That could also occur. So I think the editor definitely needs to assess the audience, and there is a relationship between, his editing and the way he looks at how the audience would perceive a film. I'll give you an example. Ray, in his Our Films, Their Films, writes that when he was doing Pothe Panchali, his cameraman, Shubroto Bitru, who was a very good cameraman and is rated as one of the greatest cameramen of all time in the world, had selected some shots which were very beautiful in their aesthetic content. They looked very beautiful. But somehow he couldn't find a place to put them in the film. So far as the narrative context of the film was concerned, those very beautiful shots did not find a place. This is something which is very important. So the editor has a very critical and crucial role, and the relationship of the editor with the director is equally important. The editor has a creative role, but the presence of the director cannot be undermined. It is in consultation with the director that the editor comes to a decision, and he's always walking on a tightrope. This is very important. Now we move ahead with the main subject of today's class. As I said, it is the creative role of the editor. Now this creative role extends to different areas of the editing process. It's not just visual editing, it's also sound editing. We've talked at length about sound editing too. It's not just cuts that he's concerned with all kinds of transitions. To recapitulate, can you tell me what are the different kinds of transitions that one is accustomed to in editing? You tell me.
This I think fade in, fade out, dissolve.
Okay, some more.
Wipe.
Wipes, you?
Freeze. No, that's it.
Not exactly a transition, that's an effect.
Okay.
Well, there are different kinds of wipes. Can you name a full-length film, a feature film, which uses wipes? Nowadays, it's not used so much, but earlier on, wipes used to be used.
Shimabodhu. Satyajit Ray's Shimabodhu.
Where?
In the first sequence, where the protagonist tells something about himself, and while he has attained his degree of status in the society, he's moving in an ambassador car, and at that point of time, he's pinpointing the bureaucratic structure of the company.
That's more of animation. It's less of wipes, actual wipes. Give me some examples of wipes. You've seen so many silent era films or just films after the silent era. They use a lot of wipes. Griffith uses wipes in his films. Chaplin uses wipes. 30s and 40s. A modern film which used a wipe is a film called The French Lieutenant's Woman. Have you heard of this film? The French Lieutenant's Woman. Who's the director? The director is a very famous editor. His name is Karel Reiss. Karel Reiss, the author of The Technique of Film Editing. He made this film. He's made several films. He's a very well-known director also. The French Lieutenant's Woman is based on a story by the famous British writer John Fowles. And the screenplay writer is a famous playwright called Harold Pinter. He's basically famous for his plays, like The Party, The Birthday Party, The Servant.
The party is Peter Sellers' party.
No, it's a different text. Birthday Party is very famous. The Dumb Waiter and so on. He's in the tradition of the absurd theatre, which was sort of originated in a sense by Samuel Beckett, although there are echoes in the plays of Nikolai Evrenov in Russia. But Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, Jean Genet, Adamov, Arabal, these are all absurdists, and Pinter belongs to that tradition. So Pinter wrote the screenplay for this play, for this film called The French Lieutenant's Woman. And it was very interesting. The editing of this film is very interesting, not just because it uses wipes, but because it is a film within a film. And therefore the editor has a very important role to play. There are therefore two parallel stories constantly running. And this has been done because John Fowles' story was the story of a Victorian lady called Sarah Woodruff, who was involved with a French lieutenant, and she became the French lieutenant's woman. So it's a Victorian story. But the story or the novel is also a novel about Victorian novels. So at the same time, it is the Victorian novel which is being delineated. It is also a novel about Victorian novels. What better way to translate this on the screen than to make it a film within a film, in which the protagonist of Sarah Woodruff is played by Meryl Streep, the famous American actress. And the role of the French lieutenant is played by Jeremy Irons. And they also play the actor and actress who essays these roles. And so while there is a relationship between the French lieutenant and Sarah Woodruff, there is also a relationship between the actor playing the role of the French lieutenant and the lady, Meryl Streep, who is doing the role. They also fall in love. So there are two love stories.
Chemistry both in off-screen and on-screen.
Correct. That is the beauty of the film, and that you must see. And there are two separate endings, there are alternative endings. So editing was extremely creative in this film. Well, to a certain extent, the director was an editor himself, and he did use a lot of wipes. And he used several cuts to show a simple sequence, Because he was an editor, he could do that. There are sequences in which within a few seconds, the same sequence is broken up into a series of match cuts. And you know what a match cut is. We've talked about it. Can you explain what a match cut is? You tell me.
I think there is eye line match. One person is looking to another and following his glance, there is a cut.
That's the eye line match. But what is a match cut?
To change the camera position in one shot, like put a glass of water in long shot and drink it in close up.
But the more
technique of
appropriate
the-
example, I think, is a dance sequence in a film.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody is portraying certain movements in one shot, the next shot is that person is doing the same movement but from a different angle.
From a different
Much
camera
more
position.
actions.
Yes, that's correct. Basically, it's a continuation of the action from one shot to another, the action being so perfectly matched that it seems to be one continuous flow of action. To take this to an extreme, look at the famous shower sequence in Psycho. Now, in that sequence, how many shots are there?
More or less 10 to 15.
There are about 45 to 50 shots in a sequence which is hardly a minute and a half. It is here that the montage or the cutting gives an impression of mise-en-scène. We've already talked that mise-en-scène and montage are some completely different philosophies. The mise-en-scène approach was espoused by André Bazin, whereas the montage approach was, put forward by Eisenstein. But here it is montage which is giving an impression of mise-en-scène. In the mise-en-scène approach, you always see an action in its entirety without it being dissected into several micro-narratives. In the montage approach, the action is split, and psychologically, the viewer is influenced by the cutting. As she said, in the case of the eyeline match, you look at something and immediately the cutting shows that thing to you. Now, in the case of Psycho, the dissection is so perfect, it's so perfectly matched that you don't feel the cuts. You feel that the whole thing is continuous. So, montage gives an impression of mise-en-scène, although both are opposed to each other. And in very quick cutting, a whole impression is conveyed. Mise-en-scène being conveyed through cuts. That whole sequence of the shower, in which Marion Crane is being stabbed by Norman Bates, who you don't see as Norman Bates. He's assumed the persona of his mother and is also in shadow, in a silhouette. What are the shots? You see Marion bathing. Then suddenly she feels the pain, and you feel the pain on her face. You see the basin which is becoming red. You see the faucet. You see the stabbing. You see the knife. And all these are separate shots. The basin, the knife, the unknown assailant, Marion Crane herself, her face, her collapsing. And in very quick cutting, a whole impression is conveyed. Mise-en-scène being conveyed through cuts. And that's how the editor has been extremely creative. As you know, Hitchcock himself was a very creative person. He's reputed to have said at the beginning of Psycho, even before a frame of the film was shot, that the film was over. Why did he say that? Even before he had shot Psycho, when a journalist had interviewed him, he said that my shooting is over. I've done the film. My film is over. What did he mean?
He had this, in his mind.
He had the shot breakdowns and the arrangement in
Correct.
his
The
mind.
entire arrangement is so scientifically done. The arrangement is in his mind that it's just now the execution, which for him was a mechanical process. The editing was in his mind. Another example, can you tell me, in Pother Panchali, of a small sequence which has a series of cuts, maybe 25, 30 cuts, but a very short sequence?
The Doihar sequence? No.
No.
The death of Indit Thakurani sequence.
It is the sequence in which Sarbojoya takes Durga and pulls her out and throws her out of the house. Set to music.
दुर्गा उठाए 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 बोलছি उठबी नी
It's a montage in a sense, but it's so beautifully constructed. The narrative is seamless that it gives the impression of a mise-en-scène of great value. So once again, it's a holistic result in spite of the fact that there are so many cuts. Any questions so far? Is it clear? These examples, you must go back and see these films. Like a single cut can be extremely effective. One of the greatest cuts in the history of cinema is the cut which has been used in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. What is the cut? Please explain.
One piece of bone is in the air and suddenly became a spaceship.
Correct. It's a transcendental cut. You move from the past into the future. You transcend the present. The present is eschewed. It's like an ellipse. But it's not a cut, it's a small dissolve actually. It gives the impression of a cut, but it's like a dissolve. It's a transcendental dissolve. So that's a great, great cut. Similarly, there are dissolve montages also. A series of dissolves. They're also called lap dissolves. And in that, the creative role of the editor again comes to the fore. Where exactly a shot will start fading out and the next will come in. A dissolve being defined as the superimposition of a fade in upon a fade out. So where exactly a shot will stop, being in full illumination and start to fade out, and where exactly the next shot will come in. There's a beautiful dissolve montage in Podda Nodhir Majhi, if you see the film, by Gautam Ghosh. And this is when they're making their way to Moina Deep. As you know, this is based on a very famous story by
Manik
Manik
Bandyopadhyay.
Manik Bandyopadhyay. So Moina Deep is a kind of El Dorado. So Moina Deep is like that mythic land. As you know, Manik Bandyopadhyay has this very strange construction in his stories. There is the element of society, the milieu, which comes through very strongly, the politics of the era, the realism, the struggle, the conflict, and at the same time, the magic, the metaphor. And Moinadeep is in the realm of metaphor. In order to move towards that metaphor, Gautam Ghosh uses a series of lap dissolves. Do you know of any other film in which the dissolve has been used effectively?
I think in Opu Shongshar,
Yes.
there were 3 dissolves in the face of Soumitra Chatterjee.
Yes, those dissolves are very interesting. It's a very good example that you've given, Deepanita, isn't it? Well, Soumitra plays Opu, and at one point of time, a very serious moment in the film, you see his face dissolved to a shot which is not very much different from the earlier shot. So you'll find that the face is slightly moved. It gives a strange effect. He's playing with the form. So these 3 faces, it's not only a time lapse, it's also the psychology of the character. And the editor, Dulal Datto and Satyajit in Opu Shongshar have created a mood through these series of dissolves. It's a question of a mood being created. I'd like to give you an example of another film which you must see. It's a film called Carnal Knowledge. Carnal Knowledge by Mike Nichols, famous director. And he has this famous cameraman called Haskell Wexler. In that is a college campus, and one shot dissolves into the next in the fall. In the fall, the leaves are shed. This beautiful nature of the campus is brought forward by the very, very slow dissolve that he uses. Before I end this episode, let me recapitulate the significant points that we have made. First of all, I'd like to talk about the examples that I've given, the creative role of the editor as illustrated in films like The French Lieutenant's Woman, which was directed by a very famous editor himself, namely Carol Rice, who's written The Technique of Film Editing. Then, Alfred Hitchcock, whose Psycho has several examples of marvelous editing, which do not impede the narrative flow, but in effect give an example of mise-en-scène. Satyajit Ray and Dulal Dotto, his well-known editor in Pother Pachali, and in several other films. Dipannita, you mentioned the example of Opur Shangshar, which again was edited by Dulal Dotto. That's a very important example. And of course, Mike Nichols' film, Carnal Knowledge. You need to study these films to understand exactly the creative role of the editor. Obviously, it's always consultation and collaboration with the director. But whether we go for lap dissolves, like in Poddanodin Maji, or we talk about the story space, which is sometimes altered, in a very subtle way by the editor, we must realize that the director and the editor work together to achieve a product which needs to communicate in whatever way. It need not have a message, but it must be a subject which touches you in some way or the other, which communicates. And it needn't only be a commercial enterprise. It is the duty of the editor, to a certain extent, to assess the psychology of the audience, and to another extent, to a more important extent, to convey the basic philosophy and the purpose that the director and the writer has in mind when he makes a film. That's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you,
you,
sir.
sir.